Greetings, my friends. Welcome back to Bookworm History. My name's Dan, and on this very special episode, as you can see, I've got some mischievous little friends here helping me out today, and that's because we're going to be discussing The Gremlins by Flight Lieutenant Roald Dahl. In 1939, before James and the Giant Peach, before Matilda, before Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Roald Dahl was working for the Shell Petroleum Company in Africa. But with war breaking out in Europe, Dahl decided to join the effort. First, joining the King's African Rifles, and later, by joining the Royal Air Force. First as an aircraft man, and then ultimately earning promotion as a pilot officer. Now in September of 1940, Dahl was sent out on a relatively straightforward mission, ferry an airplane from Egypt down into Libya. However, the instructions that Dahl was given for where to find the location of his ultimate final destination were wrong, and on the last leg, Dahl ran out of fuel and ultimately had to put the airplane down in the desert. However, the undercarriage hit a boulder and Dahl crashed, suffering extensive injuries including a fractured skull. Now, 5 months would pass, but by February of 1941, Dahl returned to active flying status. However, as a combination of fatigue and stress due to the sheer number of missions he was flying, participating even in the Battle of Greece, and his previous injuries from the crash, Dahl would start to suffer headaches and blackouts. Ultimately, he'd be removed from active flying status. In March of 1942, Dahl was appointed as an attaché to the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. However, in contrast to Dahl's previous experiences with the RAF, he hated it. He would write in a letter to a friend, "I'd just come from the war. People were getting killed. I had been flying around seeing horrible things. Now, almost instantly, I found myself in the middle of a pre-war cocktail mob in America. I had to dress up in ghastly gold braid and tassels. The result was, I became rather outspoken and brash." Now, it was during his time in D.C. that Dahl would make the acquaintance of British writer C.S. Forester, who was currently working on a piece for the Saturday Evening Post about the war effort. Forester felt that a few anecdotes of Dahl's experience would benefit the piece significantly, and he asked Dahl to write some of them down. The piece that Dahl handed to Forester was largely about his crash in Libya. Forester would think it so good he couldn't bear to break it up. The Saturday Evening Post would publish the piece under Dahl's name, with the title, "Shot Down Over Libya." Now, Dahl had originally entitled it "A Piece of Cake," but the magazine, in an effort to punch up the language, decided that "Shot Down Over Libya" was a little bit of a stronger title. Dahl caught the writing bug as a way to pass the time in D.C., and ultimately started writing stories about gremlins, devious little sprites commonly known in the RAF to cause mischief with their aircraft, occasionally harming the structural integrity of the aircraft, or messing with radio nav, or in some cases even moving mountains to cause disasters. Now, before Dahl could publish anything, he needed RAF approval, and ultimately his stories were sent to the British Information Service in New York, run by a man named Sidney Bernstein, who liked them but didn't really know what to do with them. Ultimately, it would be Bernstein who would forward the stories to Hollywood, California, to Walt Disney Studios. Now, Disney himself would love the story, and at the moment was looking for a subject for a new feature, having released several pictures that were relatively unsuccessful, and producing a large amount of material essentially pro bono for the war effort. Disney would negotiate with Dahl and the RAF a contract that would give both parties creative control over the final script. The RAF, feeling it was a good diplomatic effort, gave Dahl 2 weeks paid leave to fly to Hollywood and meet with Disney to discuss the script. The Gremlins would see print for the first time in December of 1942, a month after Dahl's visit to Disney. In a short article for Cosmopolitan magazine entitled "Introducing the Gremlins," Dahl wrote it under the pseudonym of Pegasus, a noted gremlinologist, and the story was illustrated by Disney animators. And despite gremlin mania sweeping the nation with the publication of the Cosmopolitan story, the film project started to get bogged down in difficulties. Now, Disney, who, after having been burned a time or two previously, insisted on owning the rights to his characters, couldn't nail down the exact origins of the Gremlins story. Dahl had written it out of RAF folklore, but no one could actually claim ownership or thus the rights to the characters, which Disney was reluctant to commit to. Also, Disney and Dahl couldn't quite come to an agreement on the final story, or the illustrations, even what the Gremlins should look like. Now, despite all these hassles, April of 1943 would ultimately see the publication of The Gremlins, a short story published by Disney, written by Flight Lieutenant Roald Dahl. No more pseudonyms. Now, the book was initially published with an anonymous illustrator. However, records would later show that the illustrations were primarily done by a Disney animator named Bill Justice, who at the time was fresh off his work on a character named Thumper in a film called Bambi. The original edition printed 50,000 copies, which sold quickly, especially in Australia. Dahl himself bought 50 copies, even going so far as to send one of them to Eleanor Roosevelt, who reportedly loved it. Subsequent printings seemed assured, however they were delayed as a result of the snags with the film and a paper shortage due to the war effort. Ultimately, despite the seeming popularity of the characters, the film project would fizzle out. Disney had invested $50,000 in the project, but being strapped for cash, couldn't afford to invest no more in a project he saw going nowhere. Dahl himself began to lose interest, although he did make one final stab at it, taking a 10-day unpaid leave to travel again to Hollywood to meet with Disney. However, again, they couldn't come to an agreement on script or characters, and ultimately the project fizzled. The Gremlins, however, did see the light of day on film as part of 2 Warner Brothers animated shorts. Now, at the time, the Gremlins' popularity was soaring, and every studio in Hollywood was trying to come up with ways to capitalize on that. The only studio that was actually able to produce something involving the Gremlins was Warner Brothers, which, at the time that Dahl was negotiating with Disney, produced 2 shorts, entitled Bugs Bunny and the Gremlin, and Gremlins in the Kremlin. However, because Disney was trying to acquire the rights to the characters, Roy Disney, Walt Disney's business partner, went to Warner Brothers Studios and asked them if they wouldn't cancel the project, would they at least consider changing the name. And Warner Brothers, as a show of good faith, decided to change Bugs Bunny and the Gremlin to Falling Hair, and Gremlins in the Kremlin to Russian Rhapsody. Now, the Gremlins would live on in another area, military insignias, ultimately becoming a part of over 30 unit logos, including most notably the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, which would use the female gremlin, Fifinella, as a part of theirs. Now, after being forgotten about for over 50 years, the Gremlins once again saw the light of day in 2006, when Dark Horse Comics decided to republish the original book, as Gremlins, the Lost Disney production. Now, after the war, Dahl would go on to become fairly well known, writing darker, almost horror-type stories. However, ultimately, it would be his later life efforts in children's publishing that would really cement his legacy. Alright, well, that's all we've got for you today. Feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, share the video with your friends. If you've got any books or stories that you'd like to see us discuss, feel free to leave them in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.